JJWalsh. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Douglas Brooks. Today, you're in Kagawa, right, Douglas?
That's right. Yes. Last
Yeah,
day here. Fly home
last day.
today.
Thank you so much for joining. I'm so fascinated by all the great wooden boat building that you're doing, your history all throughout Japan. You said you've been to all 47 prefectures. Is that right?
That is correct.
Oh my gosh. How many boat projects have you been a part of over that time?
So my work involves working alongside, my research involves working alongside traditional boat builders, essentially apprenticing. And building a boat together so I can document their design secrets and techniques. So I have done 9 apprenticeships with Japanese boat builders, and all my teachers were in their 70s and 80s at the time I worked with them. And I'm the sole apprentice for 7 of the 9 teachers. And that geographically, that spans from Aomori, the north end of the main island, to Okinawa.
That's amazing. And the work that you're doing, of course, is very connected to sustainability
Mm,
because, like you said, so many of the boat builders, the craftspeople are getting older and they don't really have apprentices to
yeah.
carry on in their traditions. And when I was researching and listening to your other interviews, it was just amazing to me that they don't write anything down. In fact, they're very secretive about their way of boat building. Is that right?
That's correct. And knowledge is power. And I don't think this is unique to Japan at all. I mean, I think craftspeople everywhere, recognize if they have some sort of special skill or they just need to protect what they know to help sustain their livelihood. But in Japan, yeah, the secrecy is really embedded in the craft. And I tell viewers that there's a very interesting phrase in Japanese, quite well known, Nusumi Gekko, which means stolen lessons. And should you have an opportunity to talk to a Japanese craftsperson, young or old, you should mention that phrase, because in many cases, apprentices were forced to steal their master's secrets. And in my case, in the case of my teachers, not all of them apprenticed with their fathers. And so, of course, if you apprenticed with your father, you were told everything. But if you didn't, you weren't taught everything. And the essential secrets of the craft were withheld from you. And it was up to the apprentice. It was sort of the final hurdle of the apprenticeship, was to steal those secrets. And some of my teachers had very, very interesting stories to tell about what that was like for them.
I heard you tell one of those stories that one of the sensei, one of the masters, had actually written some false information in his studio for the apprentice to get
To
mixed up
discover.
on purpose.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I've heard amazing stories myself. In addition to working with 9 boat builders, I've met and interviewed well over 50 boat builders from throughout Japan, and it's one of my standard questions. And I can remember stories like when their master would lay down the lines of the boat or the dimensions of the boat, he would pull a sheet over him. So all kinds of things like that were done. It was a very interesting relationship ultimately between the master and the apprentice.
Wow, that's amazing. And
Mm,
you talk about taking their notes that they scribble down on pieces of wood, as they do sometimes talk to you during the apprenticeship, and then going and making copies. Of course, you've written a book detailing the size and dimensions, which wasn't really written down before.
right.
How have they received your telling of the secrets? Is it like a magician, telling secrets of the magic tricks and giving that, but you're preserving it to future generations? Do they
Right.
see that benefit of it?
Yeah, I think I tell a lot of people that in looking back, I think my timing was perfect. Again, I met my teachers when they were quite old. And I know that for many of them, they had reached a point where they realized what was about to be lost. And so and in one case, one of my teachers was a fourth generation boat builder. And I was essentially their last chance. I think if I had come into their workshops 20 years earlier when they were in their 50s, I think they would have thrown me out. And in fact, a boat builder I met near you in Hiroshima said exactly that to me. I met him, he was in his mid 80s, and 20 minutes into our conversation, he said, if you'd come in here 10 years ago, I would have thrown you out. And then I was sort of shocked, and he paused and said, but now it's time to document me. He literally said that. And I'm very sorry I wasn't in a position to do that. He's a remarkable boat builder. But I think my timing had a lot to do with it. And so, yes, most of my teachers completely recognized what I was trying to do, though they clung very strongly to the notion that apprentice training was the only way to access the craft. Seeing me as a kind of a classic documentarian, while I was working alongside them as a bona fide boat builder, I had my camera and my notebook and my sketchbook and so on. They really discounted that. They really didn't believe that the craft could be recorded in a book. And I don't fault them for that, I don't presume for a moment that my books could ever replace what you could learn in a 6-year apprenticeship. And that was the traditional apprenticeship. I might just point out that for me, I call myself an apprentice. In Japanese, there was no other word to describe me but deshi. But I was with my teachers for the time it took to build one boat together. And in one case, 2 boats together. And so that ranged from just a few weeks to 7 months. So, but traditionally, the apprenticeship was 6 years in boat building.
Wow. Now, I really appreciate Asby Brown
Mm.
introducing us. And he, of course, very similar strains, I think, he did an apprenticeship with a temple building carpenter master and wrote a book about it.
Right. Wrote a great book about it.
How did you guys cross paths?
That's a good question. I read his book, The Genius of Japanese Carpentry, many, many, many years ago. And I'm going to guess I reached out to him. I'm pretty good about that. I'm pretty good about sending cold emails. But Asby is a wonderful, wonderful guy and an incredibly talented. He should not be typecast as simply architect and student of Japanese temple carpentry. He's just amazing. The social work he does and the artistic work he does, it's really quite incredible. So,
Yeah,
but he's remained a real supporter of my work and just a good friend.
yeah, awesome. And I was just in Fukushima with him, and
Mm,
you did one of your projects in Fukushima. Let's just stand back a little bit
sure.
and look at this map of all the areas of Japan that you've done projects. Can
Yeah.
you just tell us a little bit about
Yeah,
this?
so on that map, that shows the location of my apprenticeships and also major projects. So in addition to building boats with masters, I've done several boat building projects as exhibitions at Japanese museums and arts festivals. And so those are also shown on the map. I built a boat in Iwate, not Fukushima, but in Iwate, and that had special significance because it was after the tsunami, and I worked with really the last boat builder active on that coastline that was destroyed by the tsunami. And we built the most common wooden boat of that region, which I felt, spoke to the cultural loss, the loss of material culture as a result of that disaster.
And you mentioned about the Seto Inland Sea area,
Yes.
which you're in Kagawa right now.
Right, I'm here right now, yeah.
And you said there's special significance about this area. Is that right?
Well, there's a great deal of interest for me. The only boat I've built in this region is at the Setouchi Arts Festival in 2014. Yeah, I think it was 2014 in Takamatsu City. I built a replica of a small fishing boat from the island of Naoshima. If anyone knows the inland sea, Naoshima is quite famous for the art installations and art museums that are on the island. And I had originally interviewed the last boat builder on Naoshima, and I tried to set this up in the festival as another apprenticeship where I would work under him. But at the last with just a few months to go, he became ill. He couldn't work. And so I brought some apprentices in to help me, and we built that boat. So that's my only direct boat building experience here in the Inland Sea. But I've had the opportunity to travel around this area, and it's a myriad of islands. It's an absolutely beautiful part of Japan. The islands are amazing. Each one has a different culture and character. But there are still a few boat builders working in this region, and yeah, I've met some of them. I'd love to chase down all of them. Um, but that's always for me. It's always a battle to find research funding, and but I hope to do that. In fact, last weekend I took a break from this project, and my assistant Justin and I spent the weekend on Shodo Island, Shodoshima, which is right off the coast here. And lo and behold, we found a pair of breathtakingly beautiful traditional wooden boats. And when I get back here in the fall to finish my contract, I'm looking forward to getting over there and at least measuring those boats, and maybe finding someone who knows more about what they are, how they were used, their history, and so on. So my work is kind of transitioning because the boat builders are disappearing. They are passing away at this point. And in some ways I'm pivoting and very interested in simply finding old boats and measuring them, and doing whatever I can to preserve the craft.
Yeah, I was going to ask that if after all of these apprenticeships, that you have a sense of how things are done. You talk about the measurement system, the
Mm,
shaku,
yeah,
and how that wasn't such a big transition for you going from the American
right.
measurement system, that it made sense to you somehow.
Mm.
Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So traditional craftspeople in Japan work using shaku. They don't use the metric system, and shaku is a decimal-based system. And for an American, and I guess an American only, shaku is actually a really easy system to get used to, because one shaku is 11 and 15/16 inches. So just slightly under a foot, though it's divided into 10 units and not 12 inches. But yeah, I'm very, very comfortable using shaku, and probably like most Americans, I have a hard time. What's 2.5 meters, and thinking about those distances. But shaku is an easy thing for me to visualize.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I'm stuck between two worlds. I don't understand either, but I hear them, I understand them. I don't know what they mean. But as a builder, very important to have precise measurements. Just connecting back to Naoshima, wouldn't it be fabulous to have your students have a project, take over one of the Akiya abandoned
Mm,
houses, which they do a lot on the smaller
right.
islands, as
Right.
a part of the art festa, the
Yeah.
Triennale, and
Triano, yeah.
have a boat at the end of the art fest or something. I'm sure there's connections between the art and craft world and that festival or other festivals. That would be really exciting to see a project.
That would be great. I'll mention your name the next time I apply.
Yay, let's do
Yeah.
it. I know a few people around the area who also work or promote the Triennale. So
Yeah. Well,
let's
my
try to make
host
it
on
happen.
Shodoshima is an artist who's been featured in several of the festivals.
Maybe Yayoi Kusuma could design our boat
There we
with
go.
her
There
famous
we
polka
go.
dots or something.
Right. Right.
Now, one of the really interesting projects, which I love miso. So
Mm,
I have visited a lot of these traditional shops, and they all lament how they do not have craftspeople who make these wooden barrels anymore.
that's right.
And you had the experience of going to an area where they make the barrels not for miso specifically, but for as a boat and for tourism. That was amazing. Where's
Yeah.
this?
If you can put the previous photo, if you can go back one more. Yes. So that's taken on Sado Island, which is part of Niigata Prefecture in the Sea of Japan. And those are taraibune, or literally tub boats. And this is actually my first apprenticeship was with the last professional builder of these boats. And these are used for fishing. They're still used on Sado Island. They're traditionally used by women. They're very, very interesting cultural story and craft story. But it turns out that, ironically, as I say, I went to Japan to become a boat builder, and I became a barrel maker. So my first apprenticeship was essentially in traditional cooperage. That's my teacher. Um, and it's also the subject of my first book. And what was interesting, in 2003, the Kodo Cultural Foundation. People may know Kodo, the famous taiko drumming group on Sado Island. They published my book on how to build tugboats, and that actually, I became quite well known among Japan's barrel makers for that, because no one had ever written how to build Japanese barrels. And you are absolutely right that that craft is really even rarer than boat building, and really reached a crisis as, just as sake brewers and others, well, really sake brewers turned back to brewing in wood in the early 2000s. And just at that time, the last barrel makers were, retiring. And it has created a crisis. And there is also, I'm happy to report, a really, really interesting response to that crisis. A small group of younger barrel makers, really kind of the last group of craftspeople to go through traditional apprenticeships. They have teamed up, and they have these yearly workshops on Hiroshima, the island that I've mentioned right near here. And they stay and at a soy sauce maker, Yamaroku Shoyu, on Hiroshima, quite famous. And they invite young people from all over Japan, and for several weeks they collectively build soy sauce barrels, which are about 7 feet tall. So they're pretty monumental cooperage. And this is a way to start training more and more people in this craft. And it's a wonderful, I visited once, it's a wonderful thing to see. And yeah, just a wonderful effort. I mean, I wish they had more support, and they could expand this, but this is the kind of, this is the kind of terrible question that has to be faced. How do we preserve the craft? So that's a small happy story of what's going on.
Yeah, and I know it's in high demand from
Mm,
craftspeople all over. I
yeah.
went to Shikoku Island, and people who make the bancha, the local fermented tea, they
Mm,
want these wooden barrels. Miso makers, shoyu makers, even sake makers, and
sure.
even craft brewers
Yeah.
who are making beer. They want the wooden barrels because they love the flavor profile that
Right.
comes out from the wood, and they are rejecting, thank you, finally they're rejecting the plastic tubs
Right.
that have come into use because of convenience, right,
Yeah.
and going back to getting that higher quality
Mm.
product in the end. So yeah, I really hope to see more of this. Now, what you said was the most difficult part was the bamboo strap. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the bamboo hoops, there are two. So if you look closely at one of the photos, yes, that's a great shot. That is a braided hoop. That's a hoop is called a taga, and that's called a kumi taga, meaning braided hoop. And that's made for the tugboat, which is about 5 feet in diameter. That the raw material for that hoop is 4 strips of timber bamboo madake, only madake, that are all each about 50 feet long. So you harvest a mature stalk of timber bamboo, split it 4 ways, then split each of those to get 8 strips, and you use 4 of those to braid the hoop. And that is one of the most difficult things I've ever learned, and probably without a doubt the rarest skill I possess, because I don't think there could be more than I don't think there could be more than 2 dozen people left in Japan that know how to do that. And I detail how to make a braided hoop in my first book. So, yeah, the kumitaga, and the braided hoop is used on the largest barrels. It's considered stronger. And people who might see a small bucket someplace will notice that the bamboo hoop is simply twisted, and that's called karitaga. So for large barrels, you use the braided hoop.
So when we look at these barrels, are these the braided ones?
Yeah, that's those are the tubboats, and those use the braided hoops. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful photos. Just such a clear water
Yeah.
here. You can just see it's like Hawaii. You can just see right through to the bottom. How gorgeous.
Right.
And the
Well, right. And when you look at the next photo of the man fishing, you see he's looking through a sight box, wooden box with a glass bottom, and when he sees the catch, which is either shellfish or seaweed, he reaches behind him and takes one of those specialty bamboo spears and reaches down and plucks the catch. And that kind of fishing exists throughout Japan, and of course it depends on the clear water.
and
Yeah,
then
but that kind of fishing is very common
the
around
glass
you.
bottom for sightseers as
And
well,
then,
right?
yes, my teacher was very proud of the fact that he made the first glass bottom tubboats, and that these are the sightseeing boats, on Sado Island. At one
I
spot,
love
there are 3
this.
places that you can ride a tubboat as a tourist.
And the traditional costumes that they're wearing, the
Yeah.
fact that there aren't any motors so that
Mm,
it doesn't disturb the serenity of the natural area.
right.
I love that.
Yeah,
Great,
no,
great
it's a
tourism
great thing.
asset.
It's fun, really fun to do. If you go to Sado Island, you need to seek out one of the 3 tourist companies and go for a ride. Yeah.
Oh man, I really
Yeah.
want to go. Now, I last week I talked to a Australian importer, a Japanese woman who started an import business of traditional crafts tools
Mm,
from Japan to Australian gardeners and landscapers. Now,
mm.
you have used so many traditional, beautiful carpentry tools. What are we looking at here? Can you just give us an overview?
Yeah, so actually, those are the tools of my tugboat teacher, my first teacher. So on the right side are conventional Japanese woodworking tools. There's the one tool, the one small chisel-like tool on the horizontal is specific to boat building. The Japanese planes in the lower right corner, marking gauges in the upper right corner. But then the remaining tools in that photograph are really specific to barrel making. On the upper right corner, you see the curved patterns that all barrel makers use, and that's to check the angle on the edge of a stave, as well as the inside and outside curvature of each stave, meaning each vertical plank in the barrel. And then to the far left, those long narrow tools, those are the tools for weaving the braided bamboo hoop, because it becomes so tight you need to open the weave. And I believe that photo of my teacher braiding, you can see him that in his hand. And then, yeah, he inserts that into the braid, and he can open the braid in order to tuck the bamboo material and keep braiding around the hoop. So yeah, those are essentially all the tools necessary to build a tubboat,
That's
right? What you
amazing.
showed. Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. And like she was saying as well, her landscape gardener husband
Mm,
just raved about the cheapest of tools that he bought in Japan
yeah.
at the DIY center and how much better they were than the ones he had in Australia.
Mm,
So tool making, of course, goes back to samurai times when they
yes.
transitioned from swords to making tools. A lot of the tools you make for boat building are made from wood as well as metal. Is that right?
Well, I use a lot of patterns that I make from wood, but yeah, the principal tools in boat building, there are really 2 specialty tools in boat building that would not be seen in temple carpentry or other carpentry. There's a special type of handsaw that's used by boat builders only, and those have become difficult to source, but are still available. And there are some you can rework a conventional handsaw to do the same work. And the other is a specialty chisel used to pilot the nail holes, because boat builders use a special handmade nail in building boats. And this is interesting, talking about revival and response to the loss of craft. 10 years ago, there was I only knew of one blacksmith who was making Japanese boat nails. And just on this trip, I heard about yet another blacksmith who is prepared to make boat nails for people. And now, I mean, at this point, that's bounced back. I mean, I have a list of about half a dozen blacksmiths who will make Japanese boat nails. And so, that's part of that crisis in the craft. You not only lose the direct practitioners of the craft, but you lose the craftspeople who make the tools that support the craft, or you lose the suppliers of the materials to support the craft. So in the terms of the blacksmithing, that's a happy ending, that there are now more blacksmiths for me to turn to for boat nails. The tool world, I think, is pretty healthy, and it's really fueled by overseas customers. So your interview with an Australian is particularly prescient. It is people around the world have discovered the high quality of Japanese tools, and if you talk to a Japanese blacksmith, they will tell you that their work and their livelihood is absolutely dependent on their export market.
Wow.
So it has really brought tool makers back.
That
Yeah,
is really interesting.
it is
And it
interesting.
shows, also for boat making, I think it shows the power of the import market, including tourism, and
Mm,
how the interest of the
mm.
inbound market for tourism, as well as the export market of products, can really aid in preserving these traditions and culture, right?
Well, yes, and in fact, in Japan, so the boats I'm building right now, 30-foot, 32-foot boats. I'm building these for a whitewater tourism company in Kumamoto, in Kyushu, on Kyushu Island, and it is a downriver boat trip on the Kumagawa, the Kuma River, um, in Kumamoto. And if a revival in wooden boat building were to be sustained in this country, I am absolutely convinced it would be in supplying boats for the tourist industry, because I think I'm right in saying this. I think there are more traditional wooden boats used in tourism in Japan, perhaps, than in any other country in the world. And what's scary to me right now is that so many of these tourist companies, the boat builder they depended on has passed away or has retired, and the danger is that they will switch to plastic boats, because they can't find a source. And I'm currently building 6 new boats for one tourist company. In 2019, when I was here on an apprentice research project right before COVID, I had 4 different tourist companies contact me to ask me about building them boats. And this project is the result of one of those 4 meetings. So that both frightens me that people might give up and turn to plastic fiberglass boats, but it also excites me, obviously, because there could be potential, more boat building projects. But really, the tourist industry will be the first source for traditional wooden boats, and it's a big market here. It could sustain many craftspeople for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, so many of the boats that I see, like you did with projects like this one in
Mm,
Kobe,
yes.
building this boat. There is a beautiful garden in Hiroshima called Shukeien Zen Gardens.
Hmm.
And the gardeners use traditional wooden boats to trim the beautiful pine trees, like giant bonsai,
Yeah.
from their boats in the middle pond. And it's just wonderful to see. Of course, because it's a traditional wooden boat, it's such a beautiful garden. They're not disturbing the serenity of everyone who comes because it's so quiet and beautiful. And it's just, I'm sure in terms of tourism, we've got a lot of demand.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your apprentice style, how you learned just by observation without
Right.
talking, and you're passing on that same style of boat building to your students, right?
Right. So So one of the well, the first and biggest, excuse me, the first and biggest shock to me in apprenticing with Japanese craftsmen was when this man, when the first day of our apprenticeship to build a tugboat together, he told me that there would be absolutely no speaking in the workshop. And he was true to that. He did not utter a word to me except, a very, very curt command, clean, work, fetch, sharpen, and so on. And that was true throughout all my apprenticeships. My teachers did, there was no speaking while we were working. Um, and of course, that's a shock to a foreigner where we're so used to an educational style where there's this constant give and take, verbal give and take between the teacher and the student, and direct instruction, do it this way, and this is how you do it, and so on. In Japan and within the Japanese apprentice model of learning, the apprentice is expected to learn through observation only. And it is, again, it is a difficult thing initially to wrap your head around. But over the years, I've come to really embrace, I think, the power of that style of learning. And I feel like I've personally experienced the power of that kind of learning. And so many years later, I've developed both a college university class on apprentice learning, in which a group of students builds a traditional Japanese riverboat, and also a workshop, a 1 week workshop for craft schools and boat building schools and maritime museums and so on, where a group of students builds a boat together. We build a boat together. And I have tried to incorporate as much as I can this idea of the silent workshop. There are obviously rules I need to break around that. I can't have the strictly silent workshop that I experienced, but I try to get as close to that as I can. And it's very interesting to see my students' responses to that. I think there is initially, like for me, there's initially trepidation. How can we do this? But by the end, universally, I see my students embrace it. And the comment that I get most is, I thought I knew what it meant to focus, and I had no idea what focusing meant. And so interesting conversations outside of the workshop can happen around this learning method. And I'll just point out the other advantage to this learning method was I came into my first few apprenticeships basically speaking little or no Japanese. I mean, my Japanese skills were slowly advancing. Um, and the irony is, I didn't need language. My teachers were not going to be telling me how to do things. Um, and so, ironically, I could come in without speaking Japanese and jump right into the apprenticeship because language was not one of the tools of that learning method.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There is some sounds though, right?
Right.
Like you've had some masters that have taught you certain rhythms like percussion, and then others who say, we don't do that.
Right.
There seems to be a rift between some carpenters about that. Is that
Well,
right?
yeah, among some boat builders, yes, there's a there's a well-known technique. It's got a charming name. It's called Uguisu no Tani Watari, and Uguisu is the Bush Warbler, and that fully translates as the Bush Warbler flies back and forth across the valley, and so you're hearing their song kind of coming and going in a very quick rhythm. And so some boat builders, as they drive a nail, actually use their hammer and nail set to play a rhythm. And they give various reasons for why they do that. And then boat builders who do not practice this technique sort of describe it as, it's just something silly and not worth doing. I was fortunate that I think three of my boat builders would play a rhythm while nailing. And interestingly, they would insist I do so as well. But interestingly, all three of them said the same thing, and that was, I was not to copy their rhythm. I had to develop my own rhythm. And this points to another interesting element of the apprentice system, um, where the apprentice is absolutely subservient to the master, and yet there's an expectation that the apprentice will go beyond the master. That's a longer story, but yeah, it was interesting to be admonished and say, no, you can't play my rhythm. Come up with your own rhythm,
Which is so
your own
interesting,
signature.
like when you compare it to taiko. Like people who learn and join taiko groups, they absolutely have to follow the master and do the same rhythm. But they were insisting that you create your own rhythm. I love that.
Yeah, yeah,
Was
yeah.
it
It
hard
is.
to
It's a very endearing technique. It's quite frankly, I none of my teachers would agree with this, but I honestly think they did it because it was fun, and it created some enjoyment in the workshop. In fact, one
is
of my teacher's
yeah.
wives told me that she said when husband was nailing a boat, the neighbors would come to gather and listen. And
That's
he was
so
that good.
nice.
I mean, he was a musician, honestly.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Is this something you teach to your students when you do the workshops as well?
Yes, yeah, I do it in my own boat building some of the time, most of the time, and, yes, I do. I introduce it to my students, and I invite them to try it, and everybody enjoys it. It does, it does make a hard day of work go a little bit easier, so, that's why I'm sticking to that theory.
Yeah, well, it's lovely, and it shows, I think, the diversity
Mm,
of the boat building world coming from Japan, and I think your experience all across
mm.
Japan has certainly shown that as well. That you have so many different styles. One
Yes.
that really struck out to me was in Okinawa,
Mm,
and all of these beautiful bow tie
mm.
fittings. So instead of nails, using these wooden bow tie fittings, is that right? The
Yes.
key?
Yes. So bow tie, that's a good that's not how they're described in Japan, but, so yes, Okinawa, I was very eager to study with an Okinawan boat builder, and at the time I apprenticed, there were only 3 left, all elderly men. Um, and now this Okinawa is a wonderful place because it's really the only place that's seen a real revival in wooden boat building, and it's because young people discovered the traditional fishing boat called a sabani and started racing them. So they turned a fishing boat into a pleasure boat. And now I'm happy to say that there are a number of new young craftspeople, including Japan's first woman professional boat builder. And she's actually leading the way. She was apprenticing at the same time I was apprenticing. So two of the elderly masters were teaching two apprentices in about 2009. So anyway, in Okinawa, the boats are fastened without any metal nails or screws whatsoever. They're held together entirely with these hardwood dovetail keys. And if you're if you have any knowledge of furniture making, you may have seen hardwood dovetail keys used in furniture work, but in Japan, it was used in boat building. Not just most extensively in Okinawa, but I have discovered this kind of fastening used among river boat builders along the Sea of Japan. So it was used in a smattering of places along the Sea of Japan, but most extensively in Okinawa.
Yeah,
And they're
beautiful to see. It's
yeah, and they're
gorgeous,
called
and you're right.
you
I
call
see
them
it
bow
in
ties.
carpentry, like tables, and I see
Yeah,
it in tables and chairs and carpentry, even in houses. But
yeah.
I've never seen it in boats before. But it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's a great fastening, and the Okinawan word is, hundu, and nobody's quite traced the etymology of that word, hundu. But elsewhere in Japan, they're called chigiri, which is a corruption of a verb to put something together, and they're called sudzumi, and the sudzumi is a little two-headed drum which so the fastening sort of resembles the tiny two-headed drum. But in the West, we call them butterfly keys. Bow tie, you've invented a new charming name. Anyway, so dovetail keys is probably the most common English phrase for
Wow.
those.
So
Yeah.
the drum, I wonder if that's the drum that you twist and it hits with
Yeah. Yes, I believe.
back and forth like a swinging paddle kind of thing. Little
Yes,
kids
I think we're
play with
talking
it.
about the same drum.
Oh,
Yes.
nice. Yeah, it has that shape, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
it has that shape. Yep.
That's wonderful.
Right.
Now, when you finish a boat, you have a little ceremony before you launch it. Can you tell us about this? It's interesting.
Yeah, so all ceremonies around boat building are Shinto based. So Japan, there are really two religions here, Buddhism and Shintoism, which coexist. And but everything related to boat building is Shinto based. And so this is a launching. I'm on the right with an apprentice I brought from the United States. Uh, and our teacher, actually, there was no priest involved. And most boat launching ceremonies, small fishing boats in little fishing village communities, actually the boat builder can conduct the ceremony. You don't have to have a priest. And so the motifs on the boat is essentially the setting up of a Shinto altar. There are some um, standard parts of that ceremony that run throughout Japan, but largely the ceremonies, and I find them very interesting, they have a very local flavor. So there are commonalities that you can see wherever you go in Japan. It's really interesting to hear about local traditions that are part of the ceremony. And the only other ceremony in boat building, there is a keel laying ceremony like we have in the West, kind of a ceremony to kick off the boat building project. Most of my teachers didn't do that. I've seen it a few times, and I conduct it in my courses, but almost all my teachers had some kind of a launching ceremony. Yeah.
Wow, it's interesting. And you mentioned about the salt and the sake,
Yeah.
that of course are used in many Shinto ceremonies
Yes.
as a purification. Any big
Right.
ceremony starts with sake, salt, and usually an evergreen, like a
Yes.
camellia leaf or something.
Right.
That's what you're doing is just so important. I think passing on the culture and the legacy and the know-how to future generations, not just in Japan, but around the world, and keeping these traditions alive. I think it's really exciting. One of the examples you gave of, I think, outside Tokyo area,
Mm.
how this picture is from the 1960s and so many wooden boats. And then within a short time span, pretty much all disappeared and the whole area changed,
The whole,
and because of
yeah.
pollution and losing that whole boat building culture in that area is so sad.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And that was Urayasu, which is the city in Chiba Prefecture, just over the eastern border of Tokyo. And I invite anyone who's in the Tokyo area, the Urayasu Kyodo Hakabutsukan, the folk culture museum in Urayasu, is an excellent museum. And that was such a maritime culture. That photograph, when that photograph was taken, there were 1,700 registered fishing boats in that community, all made of wood. And that picture was taken in 1964. That's 10 kilometers from downtown Tokyo. And that picture was taken within my lifetime. I mean, when I first saw that photo, I thought, what is that, from the 1890s? It's amazing. And yes, pollution destroyed the fishing grounds, and that whole culture disappeared almost overnight. And my teacher in Urayasu, in the museum, which created a museum boat shop, he was one of the last boat builders from that community. But that's an excellent museum preserving that maritime culture. Yeah,
I'd love to visit.
yeah,
And because, like you say, you ask many masters to work with them, and for years they turn you away, and then eventually they invite you to work with them, and then sometimes they pass on, with you being one of only a few apprentices, and so then you are asked to teach
Yeah.
their techniques. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So yeah, in the case of the tugboat, I was my master's only apprentice, and he died 3 years after my apprenticeship with him. And it created a crisis. People on the island, Sado Island, said, "Well, what do we do now?" And they reached out to me, and what I said in response was, "We're going to do the traditional thing, and I'm going to teach an apprentice." And you just showed a photo of me with a local house carpenter whom I trained. He and I built 2 tugboats together. And then I said, we're going to do the Western thing, and you're going to publish my book. And that was my first book, which is nothing more than a how-to book, how to build tugboats, with some, some discussion of the history and culture around those boats. And so that's I'm reaching a point now where I feel very strongly there are very few craftspeople left to apprentice with, and I feel myself pivoting toward teaching and publishing, but also, I'll say it, it's kind of a dream, uh, somehow creating a training program in Japan. As much as I admire the apprentice system, it is admittedly very inefficient, and who are you going to find, and how can you support, a multi-year apprenticeship for a craftsperson? And I keep coming back to what really brought about the revival of wooden boat building in Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand, and that's the establishment of a boat building school. And I really think if the craft is to be saved in Japan, I think that's what has to happen, is to create an institution in some form or another that can provide the resources for people to learn traditional boat building. So,
Yeah. Well,
um,
that's really important and really exciting. And anybody interested in helping out, please reach out to Douglas.
yeah, please reach
Let's
out
get
to
some
Doug.
funding and a
Yeah,
studio together, because one of the interesting things you talk about is how the room where you build the boat is actually used in many ways to
what's that?
hang things or balance things. So it really needs to be a specially made studio for boat building. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is a great shot. This is inside the Urayasu Museum, but where they actually built the framework of a boat shop. And so in Japanese boat building, like most crafts, it's practiced right on the floor. There are no workbenches. You work on low sawhorses, and there's almost no use of clamps. And so everything is propped. You can even see a prop off to the side wall. Well, there's one in the foreground and one in the background, and so you have this forest of props holding everything in place. And so the shop itself becomes a very important tool, because there has to be very strong overhead beams to support the work and support these props. Yeah, it's very interesting how the shop itself is one of the crucial tools in boat building.
Ah, it's fascinating. And
Mm.
so when you do your workshops in America too, you have to find a
I have to
suitable
set
room.
something like that up.
Is that
Yeah.
hard?
Sometimes. So, yeah,
I thought
sometimes.
one of your, maybe at Harvard, you had to build a frame first
Correct.
to have that ability to
Right.
balance things, right?
We had to build a framework. I've had to do that several times in several different venues. Yes.
Because I
Yeah.
was I was watching the time lapse going, what are they doing? It
Yeah.
looks like a giant picture frame. That's
Yeah. 2
exactly what
we
it
had
was.
2 of those picture frames, correct, and that's what we propped against. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now the whole concept of waterproofing without caulking
Yeah.
is really interesting. Can you
Yeah.
explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so every watertight seam in a traditional Japanese boat is created with the special boat building saws that I mentioned before. And here's my teacher in Tokyo, where the 2 planks that you're gonna nail together are held on the floor with the props, and my teacher is carefully sawing down the seam. So he's sawing between the 2 planks, and this process is repeated over and over and over again, and after each pass with the boat building saw, the planks are tapped together a little bit more, and then it's repeated again. And if you think about it, that essentially resolves the fit. That creates a perfect fit. And it's true in Japanese boat building, there's little or no caulking used, and boats are expected to be watertight upon launch. So this is a big difference between Western boat building and Japanese boat building, and
Excellent.
is a
Yeah.
crucial technique to learn.
Was it really difficult to learn? Is
It
it
is
very
very
high
difficult.
skill?
It's very difficult, and it's doable. My students do it, but yes, it's very difficult. Though my students' boats always leak, and I have no problem with that because everybody needs a dose of humility. So that's a nice feature at the end of the class.
Now, which was more difficult, making this waterproof with the
That
cutting
technique.
it, or the bamboo strap for the tugboat?
Oh boy. Well, you're kind of apples and oranges. I'm not. I don't think I'll give a direct answer. I mean, but what I think is true of all of it is the pressure put on the apprentice to master these techniques, and really not giving any way out. And what I like to tell my students in outside of Japan and also within Japan is this apprentice mode of learning. The teacher refuses to teach, but the apprentice is required to learn. And right there, I think encapsulates the ways in which this apprentice style of training kind of turns so many notions we have about learning on its head. We in the West, we would think, well, I can always turn to the teacher to save me. And in Japan, there's no salvation. The teacher will not save you. And I remember the first hoop I was asked to braid, I was struggling with it. My teacher started the hoop and gave it to me and walked away, literally walked away. And he was braiding that hoop. And he saw me struggling. And I saw him shake his head in frustration. And he got up from where he was working, came over to me, picked up my hoop, saw where I'd made a mistake in the braid, unbraided my hoop back to a point before the mistake, dropped it in my lap, and walked away. Not a word. And, I hope everybody can appreciate the pressure was on me to get this right. And that it's a powerful motivation, you know. And I just come out of that and I reflect back upon my apprenticeships and just, it was really life changing for me to be taught that way. And it's what I try to introduce my students to in my classes and workshops.
Yeah. It's a powerful teaching tool,
Yeah.
and maybe a way to get that fire going. But
Oh,
also there must be some apprentices that just give up. It's just
yeah.
overwhelming, right?
Right. Well, yes. Yes, certainly. Yes, that's true. And yet, there's simply a belief in the craft that this is another truism of that craft. And we don't think about this in the West. There's a moral component. The apprentice, it's really a values-based education where the first step is that the apprentice has to develop the values: obedience, perseverance, powers of observation, concentration, humility. All those things have to be present or they won't succeed. And so when you talk to a craftsperson and they say, like many craftspeople will tell you, yeah, the first 2 years of my apprenticeship, all I did was sweep. All I did was fetch. All I did was, bring my master lunch. Um, that's not wasted time, because that apprentice throughout, what we consider drudgery, the apprentice is expected to be watching and learning every single moment. And so when they're called upon to do the work, they're expected to do it and do it perfectly. And so, yeah, so it's a very, it's a very interesting process in terms of the expectations on the apprentice when they walk into the workshop. And that's not something I was ever used to in my all of my education in the West.
Yeah. I'm sure a lot of Americans or people around the world can get a taste of this just from Karate Kid, right?
Well,
The
yeah,
wax
it's
on, wax
yeah,
off, and doing all the chores and not understanding what he's doing, and then
right,
it coming and him understanding it later, right? Is that
right.
the same kind of process you go through?
Right, and, and when I work in the West and teach in the West, it's alluding to martial arts training and sports. Is a way in which I get students to realize, this isn't that foreign to any of you. You have had moments in your life where you've tasted this kind of learning. And yeah, I've never seen any of the Karate Kid movies, but absolutely martial arts and sports and other things in life. People who grew up on a farm and learn something about, just sort of learned in that slow methodical way, learned a particular thing, or learned how to knit with their grandmother or so on. There are those kinds of learning in our lives, and people then remember that. But in Japanese crafts and really apprenticeship, I think around the world, um, this is standard. This is the standard way of learning. So, yeah,
Well, we have just a few more minutes. You mentioned about your dream of opening a school
yeah.
of boat building, Japanese wooden boat building. That would be amazing to see happen in Japan or anywhere around the world. What else is coming up for you this year?
Well, this I'll be back in Japan next fall to build the final two boats in this contract. And if we're wrapping up, if I don't know if you can share with people my social media addresses. I've been posting quite a lot on Instagram about this particular project, so look at my last few Instagram posts to see what I'm doing here. I'm actually 3 days after I get home, I go to Nova Scotia with two other boat builders, and we're documenting the work of the last dory builder in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. He's a fifth generation boat builder, and he works without plans, all from memory. It's very, very reminiscent of what I've done here. And actually, I was invited into this project because of my experience documenting boat builders here. So I'm going to Nova Scotia, finally get home. I have a boat to finish in my workshop. I have a manuscript to write on one of my apprenticeships here in Japan. I'm working with my publisher on a new book. It'll be my sixth book on traditional Japanese boat building. Uh, what else? I don't know. My head's spinning. Sorry. I've got a workshop.
No, it's so
I'm,
exciting.
I'm teaching a Japanese boat building workshop at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in St. Michael's, Maryland in the fall. So go to their website and check that out if you're interested.
And I'll
So,
put
yeah,
your link tree and all your links below. So
great.
hopefully we can keep up with all these exciting events and
Yeah.
activities and workshops that you're doing.
And
That's
also,
awesome.
anybody, please reach out to me. I can send videos of boat builders doing rhythmic nailing. Um, Anything that you heard this morning that interests you, I'm more than happy to try to answer any questions via email. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Thank you so much. And I was interested in ordering your book, but you said it's really prohibitive to mail it to Japan. Is that right?
Yeah, the book. Yeah, unfortunately, my book, Japanese Wooden Boat Building, U.S. postal rates overseas, it's $50 to mail the book, and that's the retail price. Is that the retail price? Yeah, that's the retail price. So, unfortunately, if you're overseas, you should probably just go to Amazon, my frenemy, as they say. And but within the United States, please purchase from the author. It's the only way to get a signed copy, and that way your book is priceless.
Wonderful. And
So.
the tugboats book, is that available still?
Tugboat book is available from me as well. Although Essentially, the text of that book is within my big book, Japanese Wooden Boat Building, which is about my first 5 apprenticeships in Japan. So if you buy Japanese Wooden Boat Building, you essentially get the text of the tugboat book in that volume. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about buying a house in Japan and being here permanently?
Well, I have, and I've been living in this tiny village, which is full of abandoned houses, and yeah, it's pretty mouth-watering. I would seriously, if I found the perfect location and the perfect house, yeah, I probably wouldn't hesitate to buy a house. A 90-year-old fisherman's house sold in this village for $23,000 US, and all the to somebody in Tokyo, and all the local people are aghast, saying he paid over twice what he should have paid. So, you know, for
Yeah.
$10,000, you could buy yourself a pretty magnificent house someplace in Japan if you
And
can
as
find it.
and as a carpenter, you
Yeah.
you would be able to fix it up to your
Yeah,
liking as
presumably,
well.
yeah. I would
Yeah.
think so.
What a wonderful project, but you've got too much to do till then.
Yeah,
Thank you for being a bridge between the outside world and these hidden secrets in Japan. I really value all the work that you're doing, and
thank you.
your documentation is really valuable for future generations and the culture and preservation of boat building. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. These are great questions and a great pair of eyeglasses.
Wooden.
Wooden. Good for
Yes.
you.
Thanks so much, Douglas. Thanks
All right.
everyone for joining, and
Okay.
see you again next time. Take
All
care.
right. Bye.